Okay, kiddos, let's get started. I'm not feeling so good today. I think I'm coming down with a cold. I don't know, but it is October 30th, 2016, and I had an idea to document something that I wanted to tell my kids, and so I decided to do that. So this is primarily for my kids, Mary, Seth, Reuben, Clara, and John. But if other people get out there and see this, I hope they're encouraged by it, or at least think about what I have to say. I don't know. I've been thinking a lot about this, and I kind of shared this story with someone the other day, and it had a pretty significant impact on them. And while I was telling the story, I didn't really realize its impact. Well, I started to realize the significance of what I was saying, and it had an impact on this person, and it in turn kind of affected me a little bit. And so I really wanted to kind of expand upon it and share it with my kids. And so here goes. Many of you know that many years ago, in the life of Nikki and Joey, while we have 5 children now, at the time we only had 2. We had Mary and Seth. And this is largely a story about Seth. For my other kids, please don't be offended, because while Seth was the conduit and really how this became revealed to us, it really affects all of you, and it affects the people around us, because God showed me a lot of things. You know, I talk about that situation in our lives as shaping who we are as a family, and it really has. You know, I don't know what alternate universe there is out there that didn't have Seth getting sick, but the fact is, Seth did get sick. For those of you who don't know, Seth was diagnosed with leukemia when he was 18 months old. And for any parent of a young child, that's pretty devastating. We had spent a few days over the weekend kind of looking at him strangely. He had some strange symptoms, and Nikki being a nurse, we had several textbooks that we looked at, and surprisingly, you know, even this was right at the beginning ages of the internet, so we didn't have a lot of information it didn't have a lot of ways to search for information on the internet, but we had our textbooks, and we had pretty much diagnosed Seth before we even got to the doctor. And sure enough, that Monday, he was very quickly diagnosed with leukemia. And it changed our lives. It really did. It affected our lives personally. It affected decisions about where we lived. It affected decisions about our future. It affected decisions on having children. I mean, it was just, like I said, it shaped our lives. And so 3.5 years, or 3 years and a couple of months of chemotherapy, and he didn't have such a good time dealing with chemotherapy, and so he was never able to get full dosage amounts, and he ended up relapsing shortly after his last treatment, and that necessitated a bone marrow transplant. And I won't go into the story here, but we actually did a stem cell transplant from an unrelated cord donor. It was something that I had done a lot of research on, and when it came down to it, the doctors gave us a choice. They had a related donor, and this that was a perfect match, and then a cord blood stem cell option that wasn't a perfect match, but the doctors had high confidence that it would be more as effective or more than the unrelated cord blood, and or the unrelated donor. And unfortunately, none of our kids matched Seth to be able to be a donor. And again, there's a long history and research behind unrelated versus related, cord blood versus not. For those of you who are interested, I can talk more at length about that. But I want to go back and just kind of talk a little bit about what God taught me through all of this. And again, I've shared this. I've shared parts of this story with some people, with a lot of people. But there's part of it that I haven't really shared with anybody. Maybe just a few, and I realized that it is significant, and I want to tell this part. Well, about 4 or 5 months after Seth was diagnosed, he was back in the hospital. His body wasn't handling chemotherapy very well. He wasn't quite 2 years old, and he was about to die. He was hooked up to tubes. He was hooked up to ventilators. His body was shutting down, is puffed up, collecting all kinds of fluids. The doctors were using words like congestive heart failure, liver failure, kidney failure. All things that no parent wants to hear about their soon-to-be 2-year-old son. And I had a really good friend of mine at the time. He was a colleague and a friend, someone that we had known from Dover, Delaware days. He was stationed in Colorado with us at the time, who had a son that had been through something similar. His son had a brain tumor at a young age, and I've lost touch with John over the years. I don't know how his son is doing, or even if his son is around. I know there was a time when, shortly after this, where his son was having some difficulty, but I probably after this will try and find him. His name's John Casey, 20-year Air Force veteran, and a good friend of ours. And one night when Seth was really, really, really sick, and I would say on death's bed, he came to me and prayed with me. We were in the ICU in Colorado Springs Memorial Hospital, and and he prayed with me, and a lot of people did pray with me, but he said some things that were significant to me, and something that I think is really important. One of the things that he said was that, Joey, God never said he would take the pain away. And believe me, there was a lot of pain going on in our family at the time. If you don't remember, Nikki was about 8.5 months pregnant at this time, about to have Reuben, and I honestly didn't know if I was going to be saying hello to a new child while I was saying goodbye to another. And they happened to be in the same hospital. Seth was down on the first floor in the ICU, and Reuben was being born in the second floor. But John came to me late at night and prayed with me and said, Joey, God never promised to take the pain away. But he did promise to always be with you. And then he said something that kind of stopped me in my tracks. And he said, and you do realize, Joey, that God knows what it's like to see his son suffer. And that, obviously it still has an impact on me today, and it had an impact on me then when I just realized how much love God has for me, because he put himself in that situation to where he was seeing his son suffer. And one of the reasons why he did that was so that he would know what it's like. And just having that relatability to God really had a deep impact on me at the time. And that was significant, and I've shared that with people before, and I hope you understand what I'm saying when I say that. But something happened later on that I think has a deeper impact, and I'm going to tell this part of the story, and I am not putting myself on a pedestal at all. I just believe that God used Seth and I to illustrate something that is very significant, a very significant aspect of who God is, and why he did some of the things that he did. And this just happened. So, fast forward, Seth recovers as you probably imagine by now. And, I don't want to spoil the ending, but Seth's still with us, alive and well at 21 years old. But at the time, for the first 5 years of his life, we didn't know if he was going to make it. So at about 2 months after after the last of his chemotherapy, which was the standard chemotherapy, he relapsed. And the doctors said he had basically a 5% chance of survival if we just kind of continued down a chemotherapy route. And he had a 30% chance of survival with a bone marrow transplant. Still not great odds, but better than 5%. So we started pursuing that road, did a lot of research and investigating, and fortunately our insurance was good enough that we had some options and we had some flexibility, and we decided that the University of Minnesota was where we were going to do our transplant. And along the way, we did some research on cord blood versus unrelated donors transplanting. And again, none of our kids matched, so that wasn't even an option to do a related donor. And I knew that the doctors at the University of Minnesota had done this type of transplant successfully many times. It was still experimental, and it is still kind of considered experimental, but they had a measure of success there that I decided after much prayer and discussion and research, decided that that's what we were going to do. And in the end, they gave us the option to use a related donor or an unrelated donor or this unrelated cord blood. And again, for those of you who aren't familiar with this, if there are any young women out there that are having babies, and there's an option to donate your cord blood, please do, because this saved my son's life. And so we went with it. Well, shortly before the transplant, and his transplant was July 27th of 2000, shortly before the transplant, I was contacted by one of the doctors. And the doctor said, Mr. Hickox, we've got an experimental protocol that we'd like you to consider. And for those of you who've ever dealt with cancers, you know that just about everything that they do is experimental to some extent, because while they're getting good successes with their treatments, they're always trying to make them better. And so there's always an element of some type of research that they're doing with each treatment. And so they asked me if I would be willing to participate in this protocol. And when they explained it to me, what it entailed, I'm sure you'll understand why there was really no choice but to actually participate in this. They knew we were going to do an unrelated cord blood transplant, and the doctors there had come across or theorized that, there's something in the parent's bone marrow that can act as a catalyst, or as the way they described it to me, fertilizer for the stem cells before they actually get transplanted into the child. And they asked if I would be willing to donate bone marrow to help facilitate that. And any parent that's ever been faced with this, they can agree that the thing goes through their head. Man, I would trade with my kid in a heartbeat. I would be in his place, and I would, and I would do anything to help save him. And when they gave me that option, it really wasn't an option. And I said, absolutely. And they said it could be mom or dad, and without hesitation, without even discussing it with Nikki, I said, me. So about a month before the transplant, I was flown up to Minneapolis, and the doctors prepared me for the harvesting the bone marrow. And one of the things about leukemia is that, they can do blood tests to determine, kind of what's going on, but to really understand what's going on with the disease, they have to take samples of bone marrow. And so at this point, Seth had been through probably about 8 to 12 bone marrow biopsies. And for the most part, they would give him a combination of a sedative. It was Versed and fentanyl, a sedative and something, and then I think the fentanyl was a sedative, and the Versed was something to make him forget. And that's a common cocktail that is used in kind of conscious sedation. And but even so, with conscious sedation, there's pain involved when they go in and take a core sample out of the bone marrow. And the procedure is such that they take a needle that's I don't know what width or thickness. It's pretty thick. It's not a small needle because it's got to withstand the strength of your bone. And they go into the hip bone and they take out a sample to examine under a microscope. Well, they do the same thing for bone marrow biopsies, or for bone marrow harvesting for transplantation. But they don't just do it in one spot. They do it in multiple spots, probably about 8 or 10, if I recall correctly. One of the most vivid memories that sticks out in Seth's journey through this, in our journey through this, was the day he was diagnosed back in 1996. And it was when we were getting that initial diagnosis where they had done the blood work and they went, things aren't looking good here, but we have to be able to rule out other things like mono or a severe bacterial infection or leukemia. And the only way to do that, because it kind of looks like it could be any of those three just based on the blood sample. So we need to do this bone marrow biopsy, and again, our young parents, and we didn't know any better, and so this was at this hospital in Champaign, Illinois, where I was going to graduate school, and not a children's hospital, and they had an adult oncologist conduct the procedure. And like I said, one of the most vivid memories of that was hearing Seth scream. During this procedure. He was 18 months old. I wasn't even in the room. I was on the other end of the hospital, and I could hear him screaming. I took this needle and just poked it in him. I don't know what kind of anesthesia he gave him, but clearly it didn't work. Thankfully, subsequent bone marrow biopsies, they knocked him out pretty well. And I don't think he has any memory of it. And to this day, none of our kids really have any memory of what happened. I mean, Mary might have some, but she doesn't have, certainly doesn't have the day-to-day struggles that Nikki and I had while we were dealing with this. So fast forward again to where they were preparing me for this bone marrow harvesting. And the doctors prepared me for conscious sedation. And I said, no, Doc. I want to feel the pain. I want to feel some of the pain. I want to feel some of the pain that he felt. So I did. I went through the entire procedure without any sedation, without any anesthesia, because I wanted to feel my son's pain. And I've never told this story. My kids don't know this is a story. My wife's story. And I shared this with one other person. And when I told her this story, it had the same impact on me that I'm having right now. And it had the impact on her. And I wonder why it is that way. And I'm sure people watching this right now are kind of like, wow. And I'm sure my kids are all crying. And that's okay. But why is it so significant from a spiritual perspective? And again, I'm nobody special. But in terms of who God is, He did that. And He did that for us. He willingly went through the pain for us so that we could live. That's the message I want you to hear. That God knows what we're going through. He knows our struggles. He willingly put himself in a position to save us. A very painful position. Now, I didn't die. I didn't have to sacrifice myself for my son. But, oh my gosh, it hurt. I've never experienced such pain. But it was worth it. So, fast forward to when he got his transplant, July 27th. And shortly before, they had done some processing with the bone marrow that they'd given me, and shortly before they actually infused him with the cord blood stem cells, they took what they had harvested from me, and they gave it to him. And again, it was kind of a seed bed, a fertilizer, is the way they described it to me. And it was to assist in implanting of the stem cells, and to assist in the growth of the stem cells, so that they would start producing the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets that normal bone marrow is supposed to do. It's called engraftment. And I actually don't know the final results of the research study, but I do know that at the University of Minnesota, Seth set a record for engraftment. They measure the blood every day to see when the bone marrow starts producing its own platelets, red blood cells, and white blood cells. And the average engraftment was about 18 days to 20 days before you started seeing signs that the body was was producing these things, which that means for all that entire time, kids are so susceptible, and that's when they die, is they're so susceptible to any type of bacteria or virus or anything because they have no white blood cells whatsoever to take care of them. And I don't know if it was because of my bone marrow, but I have to believe that it was part of it. But Seth engrafted in 7 days, and it totally shocked the doctors. And they were so excited with the results because they felt like that my contribution made the difference in Seth's survival. I'm not a perfect guy. I have my flaws. I'm not the perfect dad. But I love my children, and I would do anything for them. And I put myself in that position to help save my son. And he's alive. And that's what God can do for you as well. And he has done it for you. He put his life on the line for you. He gave his life for you. And I need you to always remember that. And God taught me a valuable lesson through that experience. And I hope that at least my kids will hold on to this and will remember this for the rest of their lives.